Welcome to GameAbstract Lesson 2. Having been introduced to the JavaScript version of the GameAbstract library, we are now ready to kind of take advantage of it and actually start to see how we produce a game using this library. So let's get to it. Okay, so this is a web framework. So if you're familiar with certain concepts such as JSONs and arrays, it's going to be very beneficial. If you're not familiar with, I've left some links to resources where you can kind of learn a little bit about it. Again, is it essential? No. But to have that appreciation of how some of these things work will benefit you. But let's get to it. So the first thing, we're currently now in script.js, which is where you're going to be doing all your code. If you recall, game library.js is actually where your library exists with all the game objects. Index.html is where the canvas is that's actually going to hold our game. And then we load the two libraries, the game library as well as your script, JavaScript. So we're here. I've created a variable called resources, which is a JSON. And a JSON is identified by these curly brackets. Within this JSON, we have two keys, one called images and one called audios. This is where we're going to specify our various resources that we want to preload before the game starts. So in each of these keys, you'll see that there's an array identified by the square brackets. So each of the elements in each of these arrays need to be a JSON with two specific keys. So ID is the first key, and we'll just write logo. This ID is what your image or your particular resource is going to be referred to throughout the rest of the game. You're not going to refer to the files directly. The reason being is that we're going to want to preload all our resources before the game even starts. It's a good practice. As part of this JSON, where we're identifying a particular resource, we also have to specify, hopefully you realize, in the end, we have to specify where this actual resource is located. So we're going to do images, and then logos.jpg. So this is identifying that we have a resource which we want to refer to as logo, and here's the location. If you had more resources to load, more image resources, you would simply do a comma and then follow it through with some more JSON similar to this. The audio works the exact same way, that you need to give it an ID and a source. And again, you'll get more experience in your game tutorials as you go through. And that's pretty much it for declaring resources. Realize that there's a variable that's a JSON that has two keys, images and audios, which have arrays, which then contain JSONs. Again, this might seem very intimidating if you're not familiar with JavaScript or JSONs, but if nothing else, just realize the structure, leave it alone, give it what it wants. So we got to go to the next process, which I've been kind of referring to, which is this whole idea of preload. We got to preload our resources. So we're going to create a function called preload. And if you recall from the previous video, one of the most important things we have to do is that we have to instantiate a variable that's a game object. A lot of fancy talk there, but all that means is create a variable, game equals, I want to get too creative, game equals new game and game. Now this game here refers to the ID that you give the canvas. So if you decide to change the ID of the canvas, you'll have to specify that here. Honestly, I would say for all your games, just keep life simple. Just leave the ID as game and make your game variable also game. Okay, so now that we've created our game variable, if you recall, and I'm going to go back, to our game object, and I'm going to close some things up just to make life easy. One of the most important things that the game object does for us initially is that it can preload the sources or resources for us. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say game dot preload, and what are we going to preload? Resources. So you can see here, this is the variable name. So similar to the game, if you decide to change this to something else, just make sure it matches this. The one thing you can't change is the structure of the data that the preload is expecting. Again, because there's some code in there that's expecting to see a key called images and a key called audios. So these you have to leave alone. This you can change. But again, why change it? It's not something that's that important to change the names. If you keep the names the same, the game will work just fine. Okay, so we've declared our resources, images and audios with the JSON. We have a preload function, and we have a new variable that's a game object, and we've preloaded the resources. None of this happens unless we actually tell the computer to get things started. So we're going to say document, which refers to the web page, on load. So once the web page loads, we're going to have it execute the preload function. So the way this flows is your web page is going to load, which loads draws the canvas, loads the library, goes to your script.js. On your script.js, it's going to see that once the document has been loaded, once your web page has been loaded, we're going to run our function, our preload function, which instantiates a game variable that's a game object, and then we call the preload, which takes our resources and actually preloads it. Again, in the next tutorial, you'll see how we can take this to the next step. Again, this series of tutorials is simply to give you an appreciation as to how the GameAbstract library works. So let's go back to our presentation, review what we've done. So in this lesson, we saw how we can declare resources. We've identified a preload process, which creates a game object, and it actually preloads the resources that we identified. In the next lesson, we're actually going to start to piece it all together and create a game loop. So wait for it.